May 3rd, 2019. Friday. It was the last month of spring. Bright sunlight filled the air with warmth, birds sang loudly, and fresh green leaves unfurled on the trees. The world seemed alive with blooms and fragrances, creating an atmosphere of harmony and tranquility. May always brought a sense of joy. Summer was just around the corner, a carefree time for students and a vacation season for many adults. On the calendar, it was only May 3rd, with a whole month to go until summer. Let's take a look at Jefferson High School in New Orleans. On the third floor of the school, there was a small but cozy classroom. The clock read 2:40 p.m., the bell for the last, 7th period had rung 10 minutes ago. This was where Mason, a freshman, studied. A tall, brown-eyed boy with short, messy dark hair that always seemed to stick out in every direction. Mason leaned over his notebook, carefully working through algebra formulas. It was the end-of-year test, the one that would determine his final grade. The classroom windows were slightly open, letting in the sweet scent of blooming flowers from outside. Through the open windows, the laughter of younger students lingered in the air as they played outside, reluctant to head home after their classes. Mason's desk was by the window, and the sunlit courtyard with its cheerful children kept distracting him from the test, making it hard to focus. He often glanced at the playing kids, imagining himself among them. The other 28 students in Mason's class also tried to concentrate on solving their problems. Their teacher, Mr. Nicholas, paced between the rows, ensuring no one was cheating. The next half hour flew by, and as always, there wasn't enough time to finish everything. With just 5 minutes left, Mr. Nicholas instructed the students to close their notebooks and place them on his desk. A group of students jostled near the teacher's desk to submit their notebooks, while others scribbled frantically to finish their answers. Mason added his notebook to the pile, and just then, the bell rang. The final class of Friday was over, and the weekend awaited. The students said goodbye to their teacher and hurried out of the classroom. Mason lingered. His best friend Oliver hadn't come to school that day, leaving him to walk home alone. As Mason approached his apartment building, a wave of happiness swept over him. It didn't take much to feel content in freshman year, no real problems beyond tests, and ahead lay summer and long, exciting vacation days. But as soon as he turned the corner, his mood sank. A group of local teens hung out on a bench near the entrance to the building. They were Mason's age, give or take a year or two, and among them were a few girls who laughed and flirted with the boys. Everything would have been fine if Mason were part of this group. But the neighborhood teens, who had once been his friends, now treated him with disdain. They had all grown up together in the shared courtyard of 2 apartment buildings standing across from each other. Yet over time, Mason had been pushed out of the group. The reasons were a mix of things, but the main one was that they saw him as a boring mama's boy. There was some truth to it. Every time Mason hung out with them and they suggested something reckless, he always refused. Whether out of fear of consequences or lack of interest, his reluctance to join in made his exclusion inevitable. Eventually, his former friends stopped inviting him, organizing their hangouts without him. Mason didn't mind much. He had friends at school, including his best friend Oliver, who lived on the next street. So, Mason didn't feel entirely alone. But there was one specific detail that made the situation sting. That detail was Mia. Mia lived in the same apartment building across from Mason's. A pretty, petite girl with chestnut hair and bright green eyes. Just one look from her, and Mason's thoughts would scatter, and his words would jumble. Mia had been kind to him since childhood. She never mocked him and always understood his refusals when their peers egged him on to do something foolish. Aside from her eyes, Mason admired Mia's lips. They were full but not overly so, perfectly complementing her sweet face. When talking to her, Mason struggled to keep his gaze on her eyes and not let it drift to her lips. As for her figure, her petite frame and the subtle beginnings of teenage curves only made Mason more enchanted. Especially captivating was her scent, a mix of perfume, freshness, and something uniquely Mia. For years, Mason had cherished being in the same group as such a charming girl. But that changed when the neighborhood teens started to distance themselves from him. Naturally, Mia drifted with them. At first, Mason was upset, but as time passed, he accepted it. It was clear that the heart of the group, Mia, wouldn't stick around with boring Mason. Yet every time Mason passed by his former friends, he tried to catch Mia's gaze. And whenever he succeeded, she gave him a barely noticeable smile. That smile kept alive a tiny flicker of hope in Mason's heart. Deep down, he believed that someday, things would work out between him and Mia. May 5, 2019. Sunday. Sunday evening. The weekend had flown by so quickly and quietly that Mason barely felt like he had time to relax. The days had passed in a blur of video games and aimless wandering around the streets with his classmate, Oliver. That evening, the clock read 10:30 p.m. Mason was returning home after yet another walk with Oliver. In the courtyard in front of his apartment building, under the dim glow of a solitary street lamp, he noticed the silhouette of a girl. She was sitting on one of the old, half-buried tires that served as makeshift benches, her shoulders trembling. Mason looked around. The street was deserted. The late hour had brought darkness, and despite the season, the night air was chilly. Mason took a deep breath, exhaled, and mustered his courage as he walked briskly toward the figure. As he got closer, confidence surged within him, ready to help. But when the distance shortened, he recognized Mia. Strands of her chestnut hair framed her face, and Mason froze in place, his heart racing. It was unusual to see Mia, always so cheerful, now sitting alone and crying. He approached cautiously and gently touched her shoulder. "Mia, hey, what's wrong?" Mia flinched. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her there. She looked up at Mason with tearful eyes, seeking comfort in his gaze. "Can I help you? What happened? Why are you out here so late and all alone?" Mason asked, his words tumbling out as he tried to make sense of the situation. She wiped her tears, took a deep breath to steady herself, and replied, "I lost my keys. I can't get into my apartment. And when my mom gets home, she'll kill me." Mia's mom worked late-night shifts at a factory. Her shift ended at midnight, and she usually got home around 1 a.m. Mia's father wasn't in the picture, so it was just the two of them. "Well, we can go up to my place and wait for your mom there. I downloaded some new games on my computer," Mason offered, with no particular reason to add that last part. It was obvious Mia would agree. Who would want to sit alone outside an apartment building in the middle of the night in a not-so-great neighborhood? Once upstairs, the teenagers greeted Mason's mom. His dad was out on a night shift. He worked as a security guard at a local Walmart. Stepping into Mason's room, Mia took in her surroundings while Mason turned on his computer. It was a small but cozy bedroom. Certificates of achievement from school hung on the walls. Notebooks were scattered across the desk, and shelves were filled with books. Mia's gaze landed on the medals hanging off the edge of one shelf. "What are these medals for?" "Sports," she asked while Mason booted up a game. "Kind of. They're from chess tournaments." "Wow, I've never learned how to play chess. Maybe you could teach me?" That evening, they didn't end up playing any of the new computer games. Instead, they spent hours playing chess. Mason patiently explained the rules, while Mia listened intently, her eyes occasionally lighting up with excitement as she grasped a new concept. Whenever their eyes met, Mason's heart raced, and the occasional brush of Mia's hand against his sent tingles up his arm. Time flew by, and before they knew it, it was 1 a.m. The teens slipped on their shoes and headed back outside. Mason walked Mia to her building, and as they reached her door, she gave him a hug. "Thank you for being there for me tonight. I really needed it," she said. Mason hadn't expected the hug. Ever since he drifted apart from their old group, he and Mia hadn't shared such warm gestures. As Mia disappeared behind her building's door, a wide smile spread across Mason's face. His mood soared, and with a spring in his step, he made his way back home, practically floating on cloud 9. May 8, 2019. Wednesday. 2 days had passed since Mason's last encounter with Mia. He was sitting at his computer, but instead of a game, he had Mia's social media profile open on the screen. Mason spent a long time debating whether to message her. Ever since that evening, Mia had been on his mind. He felt like there had been a spark between them and decided to take a chance to see if something more could develop. After weighing all the pros and cons and realizing he had nothing to lose, Mason typed a short message, "Hey, how's it going?" He stared at it for a few seconds before hitting send. Next to Mia's profile picture, it said she had been online 2 hours ago. But as soon as the message sent, a green dot appeared next to her photo, indicating she was online now. A moment later, 3 little dots popped up on the screen. Mia was typing a reply. Mason's heart began to race as he eagerly waited for her response. That evening, they messaged back and forth for hours, reminiscing about their childhood hangouts and learning more about each other. At one point, Mia admitted she hadn't realized how interesting Mason was to talk to, and from that day on, they started spending more time together. No one from their old group knew about their growing friendship, as it could have negatively affected how others treated Mia. So, they would meet late in the evening or visit each other's homes in secret. May 12, 2019. Saturday. Mason was visiting Mia at her apartment that day. He sat in the kitchen, waiting while she fetched the kettle from her room. The kettle seemed to perpetually migrate between the kitchen and her bedroom. As Mason took in the kitchen's decor, a distinct knocking sound echoed from the wall. Mason froze and listened intently. He stood up, approached the wall, and pressed his ear against it. The rhythmic tapping and faint rustling continued. A chill ran down Mason's spine. The realization hit him: no one had lived on the other side of that wall for years. How could there be noise coming from there? Mason's unease wasn't unfounded. Mia's apartment building had a unique feature. The first of its 4 entrances had been abandoned, its front doors bricked up long ago. As a child, Mason had always dreamed of exploring that part of the building but never managed to. The dusty windows, barred frames, and cracked glass gave it an air of mystery and intrigue. Over time, Mason grew older, and whether it was his shifting interests or just acclimation to its presence, his curiosity about the sealed-off section faded. It became a mundane part of the scenery until today. When Mia returned to the kitchen with the kettle, Mason asked her about the strange sounds coming from the abandoned section of the building. She hesitated, looking uneasy, before explaining. "You know, I hear them sometimes too. But whenever I tell my mom, she doesn't believe me. She's always at work, and at night, the sounds hardly ever happen. I've just learned to live with it because checking it out would be way too scary." Mason listened intently, his curiosity growing with every word. Just meters from his own home lay something mysterious, potentially dangerous, or maybe even supernatural. As Mia spoke, Mason's imagination conjured up eerie possibilities of what could be lurking behind the wall. He felt a surge of determination. He had to uncover the truth about the sounds. The teenage thirst for adventure surged within him, and he shared his thoughts with Mia. "If you're really going to investigate this, I want to help," Mia said, her initial hesitation replaced by intrigue. "I'm curious too, and it'll be less scary if we do it together." That evening, the 2 teens decided to embark on their own investigation, unaware of what awaited them and the consequences it might bring. May 14th, 2019. Monday. It was midday. Mason had skipped his last class and was now sitting in the local library archive. Any moment, Mia was expected to join him to help search for information about her apartment building. The archive was quiet and slightly stuffy. Rows of shelves filled with old newspapers, magazines, and yellowed documents stretched across the room. The smell of decades-old paper mixed with the dust that hung in the air stirred whenever students moved boxes or pulled out folders. Mason, hunched over an old wooden drawer, flipped through brittle pages of local newspapers. His fingers left faint marks on the dusty sheets. Mia stood nearby, scanning archival folders full of official documents, which seemed as mysterious as the sealed-off section of her building they were trying to investigate. "I feel like we're looking in the wrong place," Mason muttered, glancing at Mia and wiping sweat from his forehead. They had gone through countless documents but found nothing substantial. Everything seemed mundane, even boring. The newspapers mostly featured ads about new store openings or city construction projects. "Maybe we need to look at the mid-20th century?" Mia suggested, lifting her gaze from a page. "Something that happened long before we were born." They continued their search, time seeming to stand still within the archive's walls. Information eluded them, yet they persistently sifted through old records. Finally, after hours of searching, Mia froze. Her eyes lit up as she pulled out a yellowed newspaper from 1949. "Look at this," she said, holding the paper out to Mason and pointing to a small article at the bottom of the page. Mason leaned in to read. The article described a series of mysterious disappearances in New Orleans. A list of the missing people's names was printed in a separate column, but the most intriguing detail was that all of them had lived in the same building, the very one with the sealed-off entrance. "So, our story starts in 1949, Mason said, carefully rereading the article. "People just vanished, and their mutilated bodies were found either on the streets or in the building's basement." Mia stayed silent, deep in thought. The previously quiet and calm archive now felt eerie and foreboding. It became clear that what lay behind the building's walls was far more than just an abandoned section. Buildings don't usually get bricked up after ordinary crimes. "We're on the right track," Mia whispered, her voice subdued as though afraid someone or something might overhear. For the next few days, their investigation was put on hold as Mia and Mason pondered their next steps. They were also busy with school, which was nearing its end before the summer break. May 17th, 2019. Thursday. The teens began interviewing local residents, trying to uncover more about the abandoned section of the building. A few older residents recalled stories about a man named Gabriel who used to live there. He was feared and rumored to be a serial killer. People suspected him of being involved in the disappearances, but details had faded with time. The police never proved anything, and no one knew what had happened to him. The vague rumors only added to the mystery, fueling the teens' determination to uncover the truth. That evening, Mason sat in his room, jotting down the information they had gathered in a notebook. He detailed the day's events and the stories shared by the locals before closing the notebook and placing it into an old shoebox. In this box, Mason kept all the materials related to their investigation. It held photocopies of archived newspapers, photographs of the sealed-off section of the building taken from outside, and his journal where he documented their progress. The box also contained a cassette recorder and several tapes. Despite it being 2019, Mason believed that when dealing with mysteries, it was better to rely on time-tested equipment rather than modern gadgets that could fail within a couple of years. Recently, he had added a digital camera to his toolkit, one he had discreetly borrowed from his dad on a semi-permanent basis. His father hadn't used the camera in over 5 years, so Mason wasn't worried about it being missed. After tucking the box under his bed, Mason lay down to sleep. As he drifted off, one thought lingered in his mind, a thought that scared him but would have to be faced sooner or later. May 21st, 2019. Monday. Today was a big day for Mason and Mia, the culmination of 3 days of preparation for their daring expedition into the abandoned section of Mia's building. This was the mission they had set for themselves. Choosing the right time for their operation had been a meticulous process. Several factors needed consideration. First, it had to be during daylight hours so they could move around inside without using additional lighting. If it was dark outside, the beam of a flashlight would be too easy to spot from the street. Second, the streets had to be quiet, minimizing the chances of witnesses noticing them through the windows. Finally, it needed to be outside school hours so they wouldn't have to explain why they were skipping classes. Taking all of this into account, they decided on Monday at 8 p.m. By then, most adults would be home from work, and there would still be enough daylight outside. Plus, since it was evening, they could easily claim they were just out for a walk. But the teens faced one more challenge: how to enter a building whose front entrance was bricked up. The solution came to them naturally and was surprisingly simple: the elevator shaft. At 10 minutes to 8, Mia and Mason stood on the roof of their building, peering over the railing and observing the occasional pedestrian making their way home. 10 minutes later, Mason declared it was time. He headed toward the first section of the building with a backpack slung over his shoulder. Inside, he carried the box of research materials, a small kitchen knife, and a flashlight. The knife wasn't so much for self-defense as it was for tackling any obstacles they might encounter while gaining access. The door to the elevator machine room, as expected, was unlocked. With some effort, they managed to open it. Time and constant exposure to rain had caused the wood to swell and stick to the frame. Once inside the small room containing the elevator motor, Mia spotted another door leading directly to the abandoned section. It was made of metal, but, to their surprise, it too was unlocked. The dark and musty corridor greeted the teens with the smell of dampness and decay. As they stepped cautiously onto the rusted metal stairs, it became clear that no one had set foot there for decades. The metal creaked under their weight, and their footsteps left marks in the thick layer of dust on the floor. "I never thought it would feel this eerie," Mia whispered, her voice echoing faintly down the stairwell. Mason switched on his flashlight, illuminating the 6th floor in front of them. "We'll go down slowly and check each apartment as we go," he said. "I'm not sure exactly what we're looking for, but if we're careful, we might find some clues." He approached the first apartment door and pushed it open. Once, this had been a cozy home, as evidenced by the photos still hanging on the walls. It felt as though time had stopped there. Everything remained in place, and it was clear that the occupants had left in a hurry. In the kitchen, dishes were still in the sink, a pot sat unwashed, and a candy dish rested on the table, filled with candies that were likely decades old. The living room contained a worn-out couch covered in a thick layer of dust. The wardrobe was filled with old clothes, and the wall posters were barely holding together with old tape. The same atmosphere of abandonment and sadness permeated the hallway and other rooms. It was a scene of desolation that evoked unease, anxiety, and loneliness. The teens continued their exploration, slowly descending to the first floor and inspecting the apartments. Some were locked, and they decided to leave those for another time. As the sun sank closer to the horizon, they switched on their flashlights, careful not to let the beams shine through the windows where they could be spotted from outside. In apartment 9 on the 3rd floor, Mia suddenly stopped. Her eyes fixed on an old photo album lying on the floor of one of the rooms. The teens moved closer and discovered that the photos inside showed people with their eyes scratched out. The album itself was partially burned. Mia let out a quiet gasp and stepped back, her wide eyes reflecting her growing fear. Her breathing quickened. Mason was equally unsettled by the discovery, but he tried to maintain his composure. He knew this was his moment to offer Mia reassurance and support. The girl still stared fearfully at the album, leaning against the doorframe for support. Mason approached her and gently, his hands trembling more from concern than fear, took Mia's hand. He felt her palm twitch as if she was about to pull away, but instead, her fingers tightened around his. Moments passed, and Mia began to calm down, her fears slowly ebbing. Meanwhile, Mason's nerves only grew. Taking such a step in a place like this felt almost romantic in its intensity. His thoughts shifted from the exploration to the clear desire to grow closer to Mia. But a sudden crash from the floor below yanked him out of his reverie. This time, Mia didn't just gasp, she let out a full scream and threw herself against Mason, wrapping her arms tightly around him and burying her face in his chest. Inside, Mason was overwhelmed by a storm of emotions. Fear of the unknown below them, sympathy for Mia, and a shy exhilaration all mingled together. For a few seconds, one feeling would dominate, only to be replaced by another. Mason slowly wrapped his arms around Mia in return, feeling his face heat up as a blush spread. After standing there for nearly a minute, Mason regained his composure and whispered, "Don't worry. The building's old. I bet something just fell apart from age." Mia loosened her grip, stepping back to look into Mason's eyes. Her gaze held a mix of fear and a desperate hope to believe his words. "Let's keep going. We'll check the floors quickly and then head home," Mason said. Mia nodded faintly and stepped aside, still holding onto his hand. Mason shrugged off his backpack and awkwardly pulled out the camera without letting go of Mia's hand. Though inconvenient, he wasn't about to break their connection. Turning on the recorder, the teens resumed their exploration, inspecting the remaining apartments. On the second floor, in apartment 6, they encountered another unsettling surprise. The door was difficult to open, but when it finally gave way, a sharp smell of must and church candles wafted out. Crossing the threshold, the pair were enveloped by warm air that felt out of place in the building's otherwise cold and damp environment. Mia tightened her grip on Mason's hand as they moved further inside. At the end of a distant room, behind a partially open door, they spotted a large dressing table. On it stood an icon surrounded by numerous church candles. Though dusty and old, the candles looked as if they had been burned recently. Mason quickly filmed the scene before they returned to the corridor. Finally letting go of each other's hands, now slick with sweat, Mason swapped out the memory card in his camera and stored the filled one in the box of materials. The teens continued downward. Some doors were locked again, while others revealed nothing of interest. Finally, they reached the last apartment at the end of the corridor on the first floor, a unit with iron doors. "I've got a bad feeling about this, Mason. Maybe we shouldn't check this one?" Mia said nervously. "Mia, come on. We've searched the whole building, and this is the only place left. What if this is the one that gives us the answers we're looking for?" "I don't know. Everything so far has been unsettling. Maybe it's a sign." "Don't worry. We're so close to solving the mystery of this place. I'll go in first, and I'll stay right beside you the whole time," Mason reassured her, placing an arm around her shoulder before taking her hand again. A gentle push was all it took to open the old door. Unlike the others, the hinges of this one moved smoothly. It felt like someone had been maintaining the apartment, but Mason decided not to share that observation to avoid increasing Mia's anxiety. The teens stepped over the threshold, a cold draft meeting them as they entered. The hallway inside was dark. Being on the first floor only added to the eerie atmosphere, the bricked-up windows let in no light. Yet, the apartment was far more chilling than the rest of the building. The walls were bare, with torn wallpaper hanging in shreds. As they surveyed the surroundings, Mia noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, markings resembling runes or magical sigils. Above the interior doors hung inverted crosses. "Mason, can we just leave? Please?" Mia whimpered. Mason, however, was captivated, recording everything with his camera in one hand while still gripping Mia's with the other. They opened the kitchen door cautiously but found nothing unusual. It was just another abandoned space, its items similar to those they'd already seen. The apartment had 3 more rooms, along with a separate bathroom and toilet. Moving toward the living room, Mason gently pushed open the door. The entire space was filled with books and the remains of burned candles. The books looked ancient, some without titles, others appearing sinister. Deciding not to linger, they moved on. Their priority was ensuring the apartment was empty before examining its contents. Next, they entered the bedroom. Instead of a bed, the floor held an old mattress covered with scraps of cloth. Above it hung another inverted cross, this one larger than the rest. The bathroom and toilet revealed nothing noteworthy, so Mason led Mia to the final room, her sweaty hands slipping in his grasp. Her heart raced, and she looked ready to bolt. Mason took a deep breath and nudged the last door open. He gasped, letting go of Mia's hand. She clapped her hands over her mouth and screamed, tears streaming down her face. Mason, frozen in place, stood silent as his wide eyes darted around, his hands trembling. The room the teens entered was partially tiled with the kind of cold, clinical ceramic often found in hospitals. The upper walls were painted white, while the floor was covered in polyethylene sheets, some of which were stained with dark, reddish-brown splotches. In the center of the room was a wooden circle with a pentagram drawn on it. To the left was an opening to a balcony, but instead of a door, semi-transparent rubber strips hung from the frame. At the far end of the room, near a boarded-up window covered with plastic sheeting, stood an old green bathtub filled with a murky, yellowish liquid. Above the plastic sheeting hung a large black cross. Along the walls were tables and cabinets cluttered with bizarre flasks containing various liquids and chemical reagents. Scattered across the tables and floor were used disposable gloves, medical masks, respirators, and other protective equipment. Quickly analyzing the scene, the teens realized they had stumbled into a recently abandoned underground laboratory, a place that seemed to harbor a connection to dark forces or something otherworldly. Still trembling, Mason glanced at Mia. She could barely stand and was quietly sobbing. "Mia, don't cry," Mason said, instantly realizing how absurd and inappropriate his words sounded. Regaining his composure, he added, "We need to quickly document this and get out of here." Mason moved to the nearest table, set down his backpack, and pulled out their materials. He placed a cassette recorder on the table and turned it on. With a few strides, he crossed the room and set up the camera on the windowsill, pointing it toward the room. Returning to the table, he began narrating. "We are in an abandoned laboratory. I'm examining a table where some experiments appear to have been conducted. There are a lot of chemical reagents here. These jars look similar to the ones in our school's chemistry lab. They might have even been stolen from there. There's also a notebook, but it only has one page, and the handwriting is illegible. Here is a bookshelf filled with suspicious literature. The books are very old, resembling ancient manuscripts. One book is open, and it contains diagrams of what appear to be spells or something similar. Now I'll open the lower cabinet doors to see what's inside." As Mason opened the cabinet, a container fell out and shattered on the floor, spilling a viscous yellow substance. Alongside it rolled out an object that looked disturbingly like a human heart. Mason rushed back to the windowsill, grabbed the camera, and returned to document the scene. The room was dimly lit, so he continued narrating and filming as best he could. "This liquid smells terrible, and wait, what's this?" As I bent down to inspect the heart, I noticed a sheet stuck under the table. It looks like an old 12-page notebook. It appears to be some sort of diary. I'll take it with us to study later. For now, let's keep exploring." Mason spent the next 5 minutes methodically examining the room, searching for clues or significant objects. Mia remained frozen at the doorway, unable to muster the courage to step inside. When Mason finished, he packed everything back into the box, including the notebook, some papers, and a test tube containing remnants of the yellow liquid. He placed the box in his backpack and slung it over his shoulder. "All right, let's get out of here. Wait, the balcony," he said suddenly. Mason quickly crossed the room and slipped past the rubber strips into a small side area. The windows here were similarly sealed. A table with more chemicals stood nearby, and on the floor was a hatch. Mason tugged at the lid, which opened easily, revealing a dark, chilly void. Shining his flashlight down, he saw it was a simple cellar filled with rotting potatoes in a mesh sack. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of preserved food. Suddenly, rhythmic knocking began emanating from the adjacent bedroom. Leaving the hatch open, Mason bolted back to the main room, where Mia had moved inside to escape the dark hallway. Grabbing her hand, they exchanged no words and sprinted for the exit. As they ran through the corridor, Mia's eyes caught an old mirror hanging on a cabinet. For a split second, she thought she saw a dark, human-shaped silhouette staring back at her. A chill ran down her spine, making her shudder. 2 steps later, the mirror was far behind them, leaving Mia to wonder if what she saw was real or just her imagination filling in the blanks with horror. Climbing the stairs was exhausting, but adrenaline pushed them onward until they burst onto the roof. Collapsing onto the sun-warmed tar paper, they lay gasping for breath, trying to process what had just happened. "We're never going back there," Mia mumbled, her voice shaky and exhausted. "Agreed," Mason replied, still trying to catch his breath. May 22, 2019. Tuesday. The next day, Mason invited Mia over to his apartment. They sat in his room, poring over the notebook they had taken from the abandoned building. As Mason suspected, it was a journal, the deranged diary of a man named Gabriel. The teens quickly realized that Gabriel was the same maniac the elderly neighbors had spoken of. From the brief entries in the journal, they learned that in 1949, Gabriel, then 20 years old, lost his brother in a tragic incident. The journal described how they had been walking down the street when a group of drunken peers confronted them. A heated argument escalated, and one of the aggressors pulled a pocket knife, fatally stabbing Gabriel's brother in the chest. As they read this part of the journal, Mia leaned closer to Mason. He put an arm around her shoulder, sensing her unease. Despite their fears, they continued reading, though what followed shocked them to their core. The next entries detailed how Gabriel became obsessed with bringing his brother back to life. His brother had been his only family, and the sudden loss consumed him. After the attack, Gabriel took the body home. At first, it remained in his bathtub, but soon he converted one of his rooms into a makeshift laboratory. The body was moved to a different tub, likely the same one Mason and Mia had seen in the abandoned apartment. Gabriel worked as a lab assistant at a local high school, giving him access to the chemicals he needed. He filled the tub with a special solution to preserve the body and prevent decomposition. But that was only the beginning of his dark descent. Subsequent entries revealed that Gabriel began studying occult practices, believing that a combination of science, experiments, and supernatural rituals could revive his brother. Sitting on the couch, Mason held Mia as he read aloud. By now, Mia was too frightened to continue reading herself and regretted getting involved in the investigation. Yet her curiosity outweighed her fear, so she asked Mason to keep going. Mason tightened his embrace and continued reading. The later entries described a ritual that required numerous chemicals and 10 human hearts. Gabriel had harvested these hearts from the residents of his building, whom he kidnapped and murdered. Gabriel wrote, "These people contribute nothing to the world, so they can serve as excellent materials to bring my brother back to life. This week, I will claim the lives of 5 individuals, and I have a detailed plan for each of them." He went on to describe how he selected his victims and carried out his gruesome deeds. He used methods ranging from injecting substances unnoticed to poisoning their food or drink. In some cases, he released gas into their apartments through the peepholes in their doors. Afterward, he dragged their bodies to his apartment to extract the parts needed for his rituals. The journal ended abruptly, with the final entry reading, "This is likely my last entry. I hear the police sirens outside, they've come for me. But even if they uncover my laboratory, they will never catch me, and they will never find my second hidden location, where I've conducted even darker experiments. It's buried deep underground. Someday, I will succeed, and you will thank me for not abandoning my mission." Mason closed the notebook and looked at Mia. Her eyes brimmed with tears, though she held them back. The entire story left them with mixed emotions. On one hand, Gabriel was a horrifying figure who committed unspeakable crimes, deserving no forgiveness. On the other hand, his mental state had unraveled after the loss of his brother, evoking a shred of pity. The two teens stayed up late, discussing their findings and debating what to do next. May 25, 2019. Friday. A few days had passed since Mason and Mia's excursion. Outside, summer was nearly here, with only 5 days left until the end of the school year. All their tests were done, and classes had taken on a lighthearted and carefree atmosphere. The air was filled with the promise of freedom and relaxation. But for Mason and Mia, the tension remained at an all-time high. They knew they were just one step away from solving the mystery of the abandoned building and Gabriel's chilling story. That final step, as Gabriel himself had written, lay deep underground. After much thought, the answer became clear: the deepest accessible place near the building was its basement. Despite Mia's reservations and repeated attempts to dissuade him, Mason insisted they prepare for their final adventure. It was time to connect the dots, answer the lingering questions, and uncover the truth once and for all. May 29, 2019. Tuesday. The last bell had rung at Jefferson High School. Mason had officially completed his freshman year and was on the brink of becoming a sophomore. But that wasn't the most significant event awaiting him today. Evening, 8 p.m. Mason and Mia stood on the roof in front of the elevator machine room of the first building entrance. Mason pushed at the door, but it wouldn't budge. Perhaps after their last visit, it had slammed shut too tightly, blocking the passage. Without hesitation, Mason pulled a building schematic from his backpack. He had kept it in his box of materials from the start. Besides the blocked passage, there was only one way in, through the basement. The basement connected all 4 entrances via a long underground corridor, making it the perfect route to reach the abandoned section. The teens descended to the first floor and then down another 8 steps. A small square door to the basement was already slightly ajar. Cautiously stepping over the high threshold, they found themselves inside. Flashlights clicked on as they closed the door behind them. The darkness seemed to envelop them, penetrating every fiber of their beings, and the smell of dampness and mold made their noses itch. "Mason, I hope this goes well, but if it doesn't," Mia hesitated, her gaze fixed on Mason. "Look, just understand me. I need to do this while I have the chance." Before Mason could respond, Mia stepped closer and kissed him on the cheek, near his lips. For a moment, Mason was immensely glad for the darkness. His face had turned a deep shade of red. The girl he had liked since childhood had just made the first move. Mason's thoughts scrambled, but he took Mia's hand and focused on the task at hand. Clearing his throat and brushing off a cobweb that had settled on his hair, Mason took the lead. With the building's schematic as their guide, it was nearly impossible to get lost. There were 2 paths ahead, one to the left leading to the abandoned entrance and another to the right leading to the inhabited third entrance. The long, corridor-like tunnel connecting all 4 entrances stretched beyond their flashlights' reach. Along the way, they passed small rooms. Some were storage spaces for residents, while others were technical rooms filled with rusted pipes. As they ventured deeper, the teens began to hear a strange knocking sound, reminiscent of the one they had heard in the apartment before. Mason, walking ahead of Mia, tried to dismiss it as water dripping from a pipe onto the cold concrete. But with each step, the sound grew louder, and the theory of dripping water became less convincing. Peering into another room, Mason noticed something peculiar. Against the wall leaned a large wooden board. He stared at it for a moment before realizing why it seemed familiar. Memories of the boards that had covered the windows of the first-floor apartment flashed through his mind. Of course, all would look alike, and it could have been a coincidence, but an inexplicable force compelled him to check. His instincts proved right. Behind the board was an opening in the wall, a full doorway. Mason shone his flashlight into the gap and saw a door at the end of a short, newly discovered tunnel. As he stood there, the basement was filled with a muffled groan that echoed, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. The teens froze, listening intently. "Maybe we shouldn't find out what's in there," Mia suggested nervously. "Let's just take a quick look and leave," Mason replied, moving the board, which wasn't secured. He stepped forward, and Mia clung to his elbow, trailing close behind. Approaching the door, it became clear that it was airtight and led to a fallout shelter. Someone had hidden the passage behind the board, and now it was impossible to tell what lay beyond. Whoever had done this clearly wasn't expecting visitors. Mason carefully turned the wheel to open the door while Mia anxiously glanced around. After some effort, Mason managed to swing the heavy door open. The moment it creaked, a sharp, piercing scream erupted from behind it. Startled, Mason gripped Mia's hand tightly and pulled her toward the exit. But as his flashlight swept the tunnel, he froze in terror at what it illuminated. At the far end of the narrow corridor stood an old, hunched man with gray hair. His attire made it immediately clear who he was and what he was doing there. Gabriel wore a white lab coat stained with dark, burgundy spots. Long green gloves, smeared with the same substance, reached up to his elbows and were secured with tape. Underneath the coat, frayed sweatpants peeked out, and on his face was a mask with a reflector, the kind doctors use to direct light. Mia and Mason stood paralyzed, their flashlights trained on the deranged man. Gabriel reached into his pocket, pulled something out, and hid it behind his back. Then he began to shuffle toward them. His gait was unnatural, his twisted steps slowly closing the distance between him and the teens. Their legs felt like lead, their movements sluggish. It was as if they were trapped in a nightmare where they wanted to run, but their bodies refused to cooperate. An unseen force rooted them to the spot. Their hands trembled, and their hearts raced. The overwhelming thought that this was the end consumed them, eclipsing all other fears. The tunnel grew colder with each step Gabriel took, his presence bringing an icy chill that sent sweat pouring down their bodies. The smell intensified, a mix of medicinal chemicals, something sweet and cloying, and the unmistakable stench of decay. Mason glanced at Mia, who clung tightly to his back, her body pressed against his. He could feel her ragged breathing on his neck. The crushing weight of guilt bore down on him. This had been his idea, and now their lives, especially Mia's, were in grave danger because of it. Gabriel finally reached them. He slowly brought his hand from behind his back. In his gnarled fingers was a large syringe filled with a dark blue liquid.